Welcome to Mormon Book Reviews, where an evangelical encounters the restoration. I'm your host, Steven Pynakker. And it's really interesting. Mary Ann Clements has been a friend of mine, and I've known her for years. And this is the first time she's been here on MBR. And Mary Ann, I believe the first time I met you was probably Mormon History Association, June of 2021, I think, if that's.
No, well, it was Park City. Was that
Yeah,
2021?
that was Park City. Yep.
Okay.
That
Yeah.
was the first time
Is
I met all these people.
Yes, you were the up and coming new podcaster, and Rick was taking you under his wing, Rick Bennett, and
Yep.
you were completely geeking out at all of the Mormon historians. I remember you like saying, "That's Richard Bushman." And you were just so excited. And you got him on your show like not
Yeah.
too long after.
Yeah, that was funny. And the day that I asked Richard Bushman to come on my program, I remember this number. I had 106 subscribers, and I was all excited. You know, and it's pretty crazy to go from not knowing nobody knowing who I was, and then last year presenting at the Mormon History Association. I had to do it because of my health issues. I had to do it from home, but and so that's been a really, and also I've presented at John Whitmer. So to be kind of embraced by the Mormon scholarly community has been really a wonderful thing. It's definitely an element to my channel that not a whole lot of other channels have that. Of course, Rick does. But so I really enjoy talking to the scholars and kind of finding out, what kind of new scholarship is coming down, getting previews from people. Even sometimes people will give their presentations. I'll kind of help them with it, and stuff like that before they present it publicly. And so I'm really thankful that I have this great relationship with the Mormon scholarly community. And, Marianne, we've had these conversations because recently, of course, this whole, I call it a movement. Some people don't like this idea, but this movement that Joseph Smith didn't practice polygamy has really grown in the last couple years and has really become quite influential to the point that the church actually, in what were called the Gospel Topics essays,
Yeah.
actually put out a clarification shortly before you gave your presentation at Sunstone. So,
Two
Mary,
days, 2 days before my presentation,
so you
I
had to
had
like
to suddenly,
you had to
yeah.
redo a lot of stuff. So this is the thing. So, folks, this is actually Mary Ann gave a presentation at Sunstone very recently, and she's going to share it with our audience. And we're going to continue this conversation. We're going to continue to have the Cheryl Brunels and the Brian Hales and then Jeremy Hoop. He's going to be coming on, and others. Jacob Isbell is going to be coming on, and we're going to continue this conversation. And I think Mary is making an important contribution here. Now, I have not seen this presentation. I'm going to let her give the presentation here on MBR, and I might occasionally have a question or want a clarification, but I'm just going to let her give the presentation, and we'll do some Q&A afterwards. Maryann, before you get started, was there anything that you want to kind of preface this with?
Well, first of all, I will want to say that I'm not going to cover those gospel topics things just because I know you guys have covered it
Okay.
since they came out, and so I took that part out. But also, so this basically started with my involvement with the Journal of Mormon Polygamy Conference. I was having a conversation online with Scott Barrett, who's on the Sunstone board, and he was really arguing that the Journal of Mormon Polygamy was just a front for polygamy truthers to, or skeptics or narrative challengers. I'll kind of go through all of those labels. But it was just a front to give validation to their theories, which shouldn't be validated. So my my perspective, though, having just come off presenting at the conference, I was like, no, there is value to looking at these arguments. And so that's why I submitted this presentation proposal for Sunstone. So that's my prep a little bit.
Wonderful, wonderful. And Maryann, just real quick, because this is the first time you've been on the program, so for some people in my audience, they may not be familiar with you. Can you maybe just give a little of your background so they know where you're coming from?
Oh yeah. So I am a Latter-day Saint. I come from a Latter-day Saint background, went to BYU, met my husband there, very typical. I got a degree in archaeology. I ended up becoming a stay-at-home mom, and which I have been for 20 years now. And as my kids got older, well, I developed a hobby of family history and genealogy, which is actually in a lot of ways similar to archaeology. It's just you're digging into records instead of dirt. But it was really, really fun. And so as I started digging into more family history, I got some professional training in it, and then but that's how I got entered into Mormon history, is through that family history angle. And so I very much have a family history lens on things. And so I do focus a little bit more on the individuals, and I don't care as much about the big name people in the movement as I do about the side people. And I'll kind of go into that just a little bit at the beginning of my presentation too. So
Wonderful.
we can go ahead and start into that.
Great. No, Marianne, just real quick, what got you motivated to want to study archaeology in the first place?
Oh, I was a kid in the 80s, and I think everyone says either Titanic or Ramses. For me, it was the Ramses exhibit that came through Utah.
Mhm.
Just absolutely made me fall in love with Egyptian archaeology. And so, yeah,
Got it. Got it. Sometimes some others it was Indiana Jones, right? That did it for.
exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So,
Great. I
yeah.
love it.
So, archaeology is Indiana Jones. It's not Jurassic Park, just in case anyone's confused.
That's good. I love
Because
that.
that is a common confusing point.
Certainly
So,
makes
but no,
sense.
it was really fun.
Great.
Um,
Well, Marianne, you want to get started on your presentation then?
Yep, let's go ahead and
Wonderful.
start sharing.
Awesome. So I'm excited to see this. This will be the first time that I've seen this, so I didn't have the chance to go to Sunstone this year. So this is a little taste of Sunstone here on MBR, and I think these are Sunstone does a fantastic job of putting out a lot of different voices, and I'm really excited to hear Marianne's today.
Yes, and they just released all the audio for all the sessions. So people can purchase the audio. An individual session is $5, but you can buy a bunch and get a little bit of a discount. So definitely I would recommend checking out Sunstone. I've told Steve this before. Sunstone is like a celebration of the quirkiness of Mormonism. It's all about culture and it's wonderful. Anyway,
I
okay, so
well,
I'll
I
give my
like
presentation.
Marianne. I like to say Sunstone is where Burning Man meets Mormonism. So
Yeah, absolutely. And it's wonderful. I love it. I love it. Okay, so the session was titled Giving Oxygen to Conspiracy Theories: Why Scholars Need to Address Polygamy, Truther Arguments. And my intended audience is for the people who think that the polygamy truthers, the polygamy skeptics are nuts. That's who I'm trying to talk to here. Um, so that's why I give oxygen to conspiracy theories, because that's a statement a lot of people have made. I don't want to platform these people. I don't want to give oxygen to conspiracy theories.
yep.
Okay, so like I mentioned before, and this is here we go. Okay. So my interest in Mormon history comes from family history. And so my first foray into publishing on early Mormon polygamy was from this book called Secret Covenants. It came out in 2024. Cheryl Bruno, who you had on recently, she was the editor for it. And most of the essays in this book are actually about Joseph Smith's polygamy. My essay, she had put a call out. There were some people that had fallen through on it. And so I actually asked him, like, would it be okay if I did an essay on my ancestor, who was an early Mormon polygamist, on his three wives, the three women he married? Because they really have fascinating stories. And they were in that early polygamy period, that Nauvoo period. But they were three sisters who came from the same socioeconomic background, same family, but they each, their individual life experiences made them have different approaches to polygamy. And for two of them, they really embraced it. They had kids with my ancestor. For one of them, it was absolutely more in name only. It was it was just these stories were fascinating, but it helped you understand why they may have considered polygamy as an option. And so, and there had also been a whole lot of bad information published over the years by both historians and family historians about this ancestor and about these wives and the dates of their marriages and who the kids were kids of. So I also wanted to kind of correct the record, because now that I had done that research and I had found out more information, I found out where a lot of just information was wrong. Um, I wanted to write that essay. And so my ancestor, Theodore Turley, he's not usually important enough for people to really dig into. So the scholars just kept repeating the same bad information. Gary Bergera was the only scholar who actually questioned the family's plural marriage date, the early date of January 1842 for Theodore Turley and one of these women, Mary Clift. Because when he was doing research on the Nauvoo Council records, he found out where Mary Clift actually said who was the biological father of her child because she was very pregnant at the time, and it wasn't Theodore Turley. And so he was the one that kind of initially was like, I think the family may have backdated this marriage. I don't think this was an early plural marriage. So I am fully aware that the traditional narrative is sometimes based on faulty data that should be challenged, that should be questioned, because I've personally had to deal with that.
Okay, great.
But people who are interested in this topic generally, there are two, I mean, all of these essays in this book are fantastic, but there's two essays that I want to highlight specifically. So there's Mark Tensmeyer's Old Women's Tales versus Historical Verification of Joseph Smith's Polygamy. That actually really goes through, and it's the first published essay on this newer movement of polygamy skepticism. He calls it the monogamist model. Um, and so that is just a great introduction to the movement. But then I also recommend the very last essay in the volume, which is a brief influence biography of Joseph Smith's July 12th, 1843 Revelation on Marriage. It's by William Victor Smith. And the reason why I recommend it is that it talks about the impact that the polygamy revelation has had on the theology practices and even political positions of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints over the last 180 years. And again, this is the Utah-based church. And you'll better understand why it's highly unlikely this section will ever be removed from LDS scriptural canon, because you'll understand a lot better just how entangled it is. It's so many different aspects of the Utah-based LDS tradition. Um, Okay. So what do I mean when I say truther? Why am I using the word truther? So typically in the past, people have used skeptic, polygamy denier, monogamy affirmer. Just this last couple of weeks, I've seen narrative skeptic, I've seen narrative challenger. And I'm just basically saying it as shorthand in this presentation for anyone from a primarily LDS background who currently argues that Mormon polygamy originated with Brigham Young rather than Joseph Smith. Um, I so the reason why I got the term truther from Scott Barrett, who I mentioned earlier, I think it's more accurate than denier when considering how these people view themselves. So denialism is the practice of denying the existence, truth, or validity of something despite proof or strong evidence. Um, a truther, on the other hand, is someone who believes that the truth about an important subject or event is being concealed from the public by a powerful conspiracy. So, when we're dealing with Nauvoo polygamy, we're dealing with conspiracies regardless. During the Nauvoo period, whether you believe polygamy was started by Joseph Smith or Brigham Young, it was a conspiracy. You had a secret group, you had insiders, you had outsiders. But what is different about this movement is they believe that there was a conspiracy in the later 1800s that where all the current alleged proof and strong evidence, all of these affidavits, all of these testimonies, they were that modern historians and apologists take for granted. They were crafted in the second half of the 19th century by a massive conspiracy of men and women, including church leaders like Brigham Young, William Clayton, and Joseph F. Smith. Records were falsified, testimonies were coerced, all to justify this practice. And a tactic used by these conspirators was to incorporate elements from prior public allegations of Joseph Smith's practice of plural marriage, published by John C. Bennett in 1842, and in the Nauvoo Expositor to lend credibility to their narrative. So, where a lot of traditional people that go with the traditional narrative will be like, well, why is there elements of 132 Nauvoo Expositor from 1844? And people are like, oh, they purposely put that in 132. But it's still a later creation, but they purposely put it in because they were looking at the expositor and they were adding those details. So if we actually look at the mainstream narrative that they are pushing against, so just to kind of go over this for people who may not know, this is coming from the the LDS Church's Gospel Topics essay that they published in October of 2014. So you basically had 1831 with Joseph Smith's translation of the Old Testament. He introduced questions about the propriety of plural marriage. Mid 1830s, we have Joseph Smith marrying Fanny Alger as his first plural wife. Again, this is according to the church's narrative. In April 1841, Joseph Smith married Loisa Beeman in Nauvoo. Between 1841 and 1844, Joseph Smith married 30 to 40 women, some of whom were legally married to other men, and he also began introducing the principle of plural marriage quietly to trusted associates. On July 1843, Joseph Smith dictated the polygamy revelation with William Clayton acting as scribe. Joseph Kingsbury made a copy of the document sometime before the original was destroyed, and in June of 1844, Joseph Smith was killed. At the time of his death, about 29 men and 50 women participated in plural marriages. So that's the narrative that people are challenging on this movement.
Okay.
So this is Jeremy Hoop. He's one of the big YouTubers, champions of this current truther movement. So what's the polygamy truther version? So in reaction to the term polygamy denier, Jeremy summarized what he was denying. He said, I do not deny that polygamy happened in the early days of the Restoration, but I do deny that there is any credible evidence that Joseph Smith practiced, taught, or even believed in it. In this quote, the word credible is doing some heavy lifting. So folks in the truther movement rely heavily on discrediting what little contemporary evidence we do have of Joseph Smith's practice of Nauvoo polygamy, especially William Clayton's Nauvoo journals and the Kingsbury copy of the 1843 Revelation. So then if you look at the second quote, he says, I also deny that polygamy was ever a good or a godly thing, but rather has always been what Joseph Smith in the Book of Mormon called an abomination and a whoredom. So the second quote, it's a value judgment. So polygamy is inherently evil, right? Like the practice is just wrong, period. This is a theological position. So like Joseph Smith III in the 19th century, they defend Joseph Smith as a good and virtuous person, which is fundamentally incompatible with practicing plural marriage. The framing is about believing Joseph Smith, specifically his public denials of polygamy, and accusations that Joseph was lying or artfully deceiving folks in his public statements are viewed as smears on his good name. In contrast, early leaders like Brigham Young, Heber C. Kimball, and William Clayton were liars and adulterers who developed their own system of spiritual lifery, first in England, then in Nauvoo. And just like the villain John C. Bennett, they falsely claimed Joseph Smith's approval to achieve their own wicked ends. So this is where we're running into a little bit of issues because we've got the historical element, but then we've also got this value judgment, this theological element of the movement, which is what can make it a little difficult to work with. Um, so as far as anyone listening, so with my positions, I do believe that Joseph Smith practiced polygamy, but I also believe that we have a lot more to learn about 1840s Mormon history. So we're going to talk about the development of this most recent polygamy movement and movement claiming that Brigham Young started polygamy instead of Joseph Smith. And so my goal is to show you that it's not simply a rehashing of old RLDS arguments from the 19th century. There is a critical component which not only differentiates this movement from earlier efforts, but also makes it potentially valuable to scholars of early Mormon history. So I'm going to briefly go over the early efforts. So to claim that Joseph Smith was not a polygamist and how that played into the development of our current mainstream narrative. So when the reorganized movement was coalescing around the Midwest Saints in the 1850s, one of the few elements of agreement among these disparate groups was that polygamy was bad. So the official position of the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which is now Community of Christ, but their official position originally was neutral as to whether or not Joseph Smith actually practiced plural marriage. The first president, Joseph Smith III, he was not neutral in any way on the topic. In his first address, he said, I've been told that my father taught such doctrines. I've never believed it, and I never can believe it. But it wasn't until the late 1860s that the position began to alarm Utah church leaders. So in 1866, Alexander Hale Smith served a short mission to Utah, and he was only out here for a few weeks. But the day after he left, Heber C. Kimball walked into the historian's office and gave his testimony on the origins of plural marriage in Nauvoo. And then an early list, likely compiled around that time, placed Joseph's three earliest Nauvoo plural marriages in the year 1840. And people that know this history, they should immediately pick up the 1840s too early. The current mainstream narrative says that the first marriages didn't occur until 1841. So even at this time, they're trying to figure this out. By January of 1869, however, Joseph Bates Noble was publicly stating that he performed Joseph Smith's first Nauvoo plural marriage in May of 1841, which again is different from now, which we say it was April of 1841 because that's what the later affidavits say. So when word got to Utah that both Alexander Hale Smith and David Hiram Smith would be arriving as missionaries in 1869, Joseph F. Smith began to look for documentation of Joseph Smith's practice of polygamy. Besides the 1843 revelation itself, he couldn't find anything. As a result, he began recording affidavits from those who received personal instruction or commandment from the prophet respecting the subject of celestial marriage. So, in short, the mountains of evidence that we have for Joseph Smith's polygamy comes primarily from that second half of the 19th century, specifically as the LDS and the RLDS churches were battling over the topic. We have affidavits from 1869 and onwards. Andrew Jensen, he was a Scandinavian convert from later in the 19th century. He did his own personal investigation in the 1880s, where he talked to a lot of these women that had been plural wives. And also, we have testimonies resulting from the Temple Lot case in the early 1890s. Now, in 2015, Gary Bergera was the first big historian to start sounding an alarm that scholars like himself were being too uncritical of these later reminiscences. So, in this book, which I'd really recommend, the LDS Gospel Topics series, a scholarly engagement edited by Matt Harris and Noel Bringhurst, Bergera wrote a commentary on that church's early polygamy gospel topics essay that I showed you earlier that discusses the malleability of memory. The contemporary first person sources for the beginnings of Mormon polygamy are almost non existent, he said. Our knowledge of the subject depends almost entirely upon later memory based reminiscences, narratives both subject to numerous influences and fragile. Scholars need to exercise special caution in excavating and interpreting the story of Mormon polygamy. So while Gary Bergera is trying to kind of sound the alarm that, hey, maybe we haven't been critical enough of these later reminiscences, we have the start of this new skeptic movement. So the main RLDS Church, Community of Christ, began accepting that polygamy originated with Joseph Smith in the 1980s, but some schismatic groups from that tradition, called the Restoration branches, still maintain that Joseph Smith was a monogamist. And I know you recently got some magazines, like a subscription to
Yeah.
magazines from the Restoration
Yeah,
branches.
so this is Restoration Branches. They have their own
Mhm.
magazine. I also want to make it clear too. I know I just want to be respectful, and I understand why, as a scholar, you'd say schismatic groups from the organized tradition.
That
They
was
would
a, yeah,
they would look
sorry,
at themselves as being the true
the true branch.
continuation
Yes.
of exactly. So that's how they would view themselves. So
Right. And yeah, that was a phrase I think John Hamer had used, and so that's why I used it. But yeah, so they saw the RLDS church as going a little bit too liberal in the 1980s with the ordination of women
mhm.
and, denying the historicity of the Book of Mormon. So there were several elements that they disagreed with the direction of where the RLDS church was going. And so they stuck with the more traditional but one of the elements that they stuck with was that Joseph Smith was a monogamist. And so, okay, so before 2010, so in the 21st century, before 2010, that's where we see this still lying, is mainly in these restoration branches.
Mhm.
The crossover to the LDS audiences seems to have begun around 2010 with Rock Waterman.
Mhm.
Um, so he was a blogger. He declared that he'd given up believing that Joseph Smith was a polygamist after reading Joseph Fought Polygamy, which was a book written by Restoration Branch members Richard and Pamela Price. So Waterman was influential among politically conservative and libertarian Latter-day Saint members.
Mhm.
Um, but his post on the necessity of revising our understanding of Mormon history, including Joseph Smith's practice of polygamy, reached wider audiences when it was published on Mormon Matters, which was a group blog associated with John Dillon. So if you can think about what was happening. So this was the explosion of the internet. This was a lot of
Mhm.
people encountering elements of Mormon history that they hadn't heard before.
Yeah.
When the RLDS Church admitted or switched to saying that Joseph Smith was a polygamist, the LDS Church kind of backed off on that. So when I was a kid, a teenager in the 90s, that was not emphasized remotely. And so we were getting a lot more emphasis on Joseph and Emma as this ideal
Mhm.
monogamous couple. And
Mhm.
so it really was. So at the turn of the century, it was kind of a shock for a lot of us, even if we had known in the back of our heads that,
Yeah.
yeah, he kind of was a polygamist. I just remember as a young married person, like reading online, and he was like, and I was like, wait, Emma saw what with Joseph in the barn? Like, I mean, it really was kind of a shock.
Yep.
The
Yep.
late 1990s is also when we get Todd Compton in Sacred Loneliness. So we're getting a lot more of these details. So, yeah, so I mean, there's this whole upheaval. So you got to see that this movement is starting, but it's part of that whole internet
Mhm.
introducing these new ideas, right?
Yeah.
Or old ideas, as the case may be. So, but what makes this movement different? So in 2013, we have Brian Hales and Don Bradley. They're publishing Joseph Smith's Polygamy, but we're also starting to get these kind of alternate theories. We have Meg Stout with Millennial Star. She's doing a Faithful Joseph series. So, and her book eventually becomes a Reluctant Polygamist. We get the Gospel Topics essay, The Plural Marriage in Kirtland and Nauvoo, which really shocked a lot of people that the church would admit, and some people what some people viewed as anti-Mormon lies, right? And
Mhm.
the church would admit these. We have in 2015, we have Denver Snuffer kind of
Yep.
coming around to this idea that maybe he didn't practice polygamy. So he was a little bit of a later convert to this idea. But we also get a Year of Polygamy podcast episode with Lindsay Anson Park and John Hamer going, hey guys, this is an old idea. We really don't need to take it seriously. This is not something that we should even be entertaining. Brian Hales wrote a response to Denver Snuffer's essay. Um, but again, in the same year, 2015, he's also writing a response to Gary Bergera's essay saying that we need to take this stuff look at it more critically. So
Mhm.
like you start to see why a lot of the scholars are kind of shutting Gary Bergera down because they're like, no, 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 we don't even want to introduce the element that
Right.
some of this needs to be questioned, right? Because we're starting
Uh-huh.
to get this other movement coming up. Um, we get Leo Ebert does the first Joseph Smith monogamy essay, which is the first real like clear um, discussion of this particular theory. We get Ron Caron, exoneration of Emma, Joseph, and Hiram. And then after 2019, we get this explosion of online creators, primarily video-based creators, and that becomes important. So what makes this movement different from the old RLDS theories?
Mhm.
And so I want to show two quotes. This is from Jeremy Hoop. And he says, in a day when anyone who wants to can look at exactly the same historical documents that the historians have studied, at a time when anyone who's willing to put in the required time to go through all the evidence, which thanks to the internet is actually available for anyone to view, all it takes is the willingness to put into work. And then a statement from Karen Hyatt. She wrote originally it was a video, Woe Unto You Scribes, but it's also a book too. Um, it says, while most of us, including busy church leaders, have typically gotten our history filtered through professional researchers, we can now examine thousands of original and contemporaneous documents, meaning documents created during Joseph's lifetime, for ourselves, thanks in large part to the Joseph Smith Papers Project. These documents demonstrate that Joseph Smith consistently opposed polygamy as an abomination, that he denied ever having taught or practiced it, and that, contrary to the narrative perpetuated by well-meaning historians, Joseph was, in fact, telling the truth. So, what makes this movement different? It's the reliance on these digitized historical records. So, when we go back to this timeline, we can see how huge document collections from early Mormon history are being made available for anyone to view. So, we have the Joseph Smith papers beginning in 2008. We have the Church History Library catalog going online in 2011. And then in 2013, we get Brian Hales and Don Bradley's Mormon polygamy documents in 2013. So as people are starting to look at these images of these historical documents, they start personally noticing the lack of contemporary documentation for Nauvoo polygamy. In fact, they start seeing all these statements from Joseph and Hiram denouncing it. And then they see all the revisions that Utah leaders made to the official history, including changing words of Joseph Smith himself to change from, you shouldn't practice plural marriage to, yes, you can do it under these certain circumstances. So they began to suspect, so as you see all of these edits, as you're seeing this change to the history, they began to suspect that the entire story of Joseph Smith's polygamy was a later fabrication. And so these document images proved that Joseph Smith and subsequent leaders conspired to change the public memory of Joseph Smith. So that's one reason why video is the preferred media format for this group. So with the integrity, a lot of these folks are very suspicious anyway of institutional authority, whether it's government, ecclesiastical institutions, academic institutions. So if you can't trust those people, you trust yourself, right? So, but with the integrity of these institutions in question, the document images themselves become the arbiters of truth. They become the sole authority. And so, one way I'll kind of explain it to people, it's like with the Protestant Reformation, it's kind of that sola scriptura belief of the Protestants, where it's like, look, if we look at the Bible, everything we need to know is in the Bible. We can discover ourselves. We don't need this outside hierarchy, church hierarchy, to interpret it, right? And this
Mhm.
is kind of their similar belief. Like if we look at these documents, we can determine what actually happened ourselves. We don't need these outside so-called experts to tell us what to think about these documents. We can look and we can see for ourselves.
Mhm.
Um, and so while I do support reading, I support getting outside context. I absolutely support reading scholarly literature. One point that I want to bring out is it's actually good to have more eyes on these documents. It's
Mhm.
actually a good thing to have more people looking at these. And just as a personal note, every time I've dug into these polygamy truther arguments, I've ended up finding new Mormon history rabbit holes that actually really do deserve closer scrutiny,
Yep,
right? I mean, like there
I
is still
agree.
a lot we don't know about
Yep,
Mormon history.
I agree totally. And that's why I don't I was kind of intimidated not to platform this movement in the past. And I just think it's first of all, I think that chart you showed is invaluable. I think that's great information. And you can see that there's this conversation that's going on. You can see the evolution and development of this movement. So cheers for doing that. That's really great. I think it gives us good context. So continue. I'm sorry. I just want to
Yeah.
throw that.
Nope, you're good. Yep. I love seeing that you can see when these image collections come online. I mean,
Yep.
this is what's really driving the movement.
Hmm.
So, I mean, it's people looking at these images themselves. So, scholar Maxine Hanks gave some great comments in an online discussion, and she says, "I want to see scholars engage in the polygamy deniers' premises and point out the specific flaws therein, along with any valid arguments and evidence in dialectic fashion. I think it's worthwhile. The historical truth that Joseph did practice polygamy, which she and I share that same position, does not mean these discussions are useless. It means they sharpen our understanding of how Joseph and others practiced polygamy and how it evolved. So basically, we should be paying attention to the stuff that these polygamy truthers are finding, even if we're coming to different conclusions about what that evidence means. Um, and then I go through and I share an example. So Jeremy had just come out with this video discussing the Kingsbury versus the Richards copies of the 1843 Revelation. And um, so in a 2.5 hour video posted on the Still Mormon YouTube channel, Jeremy Hoop compared the copies of the July 1843 Polygamy Revelation as written by Willard Richards, which is shown on the left, and the Joseph Kingsbury copy shown on the right. The traditional narrative is that we've understood that the Kingsbury copy of the one on the right was the earlier one. Um, but Jeremy is arguing that the Richards copy, the one on the left, predates the Kingsbury copy. He believes they were both likely created in 1852, shortly before the revelation was publicly announced and read in general conference. And he argues that editorial pencil marks on the Richards copy proves it was an earlier draft, and the Kingsbury copy was the later finished version. So, in an online discussion afterwards, I pointed out that there's no way I was buying that because The staining and the wear on the Kingsbury document shown on the right, there's no way Jeremy was going to convince me that it was a more recent document than the Richards copy. So Cheryl Bruno correctly called me out, saying that you can't tell the age of a document based solely on what it looks like, especially when we're just dealing with digital images. And she's right on that.
Yeah.
I was wrong on that. But to me, it still didn't make sense. If both the Richards copy and the Kingsbury copy were written about the same time, why did the Kingsbury copy clearly display more evidence of handling? Like the wear, the staining, that's evidence of handling. Um, so the Deseret News published the Polygamy Revelation shortly after that general conference, so copies of the Revelation were readily available to anyone who wanted them. At that point, you wouldn't need to pull out the Kingsbury manuscript to make your own handwritten copy of the Revelation. And so those of us who go with the traditional narrative would argue that Richards was probably trying to make an accurate transcription of the earlier Kingsbury copy, and the pencil edits were where he was correcting the inaccuracies in the transcription. Okay, and so this is where I kind of zoom in a little bit. So those of us who go with the traditional narrative would argue that Richards, or sorry, I already said that. Jeremy made a big deal of one edit that reverses the meaning of a phrase. So on the Richards document, which is at the top of the slide, Richards originally writes, and again I say, let my servant Joseph put his property out of his hands, lest an enemy come and destroy him. And in pencil, Richards later inserted the word not to match the Kingsbury document, which is below, which states, and again I say, let not my servant Joseph put his property out of his hands, lest an enemy come and destroy him. So both Jeremy and the folks at the Joseph Smith Papers suggest that this line has to deal with a real estate transaction. Um, I don't think it does. I don't think the word property here refers to real estate. Um, but I wanted to highlight these lines for a different reason. So if you look at the screen, you'll notice that the one on the bottom, the Kingsbury manuscript, also has some editorial marks. So this was an important point brought up by Robin Jensen, who's an archivist who works at the Church History Library. So in an online conversation about that presentation, Robin said, the ink and stylistic additions to the Kingsbury manuscript, largely to the punctuation and pilcrows, mirror the ink and style of the Richards document. And if you don't know what a pilcrow is, don't feel bad because I didn't either. It's that word for that paragraph symbol that's used for that symbol right there to indicate a new paragraph. So you learned something, pilcrow. So what that means is that as Willard Richards was doing his transcription of the Kingsbury document, he noted on the Kingsbury document where he was deciding to start new paragraphs. And you can also see that Richards corrected the spelling of words like lest and destroy and added capitalization to the and at the beginning of the new paragraph he created. So the one on top is doing the correct spelling and adding the capitalization, whereas the one on the bottom has misspelled words in lowercase. So to me, I see that that's why those of us who'd go with the traditional narrative would see the Richards copy as him correcting the mistakes of the Kingsbury, which is why we would see it as a later document. Okay, so now I'm going to switch over to that property transaction. So again, I wouldn't have looked at these documents had Jeremy not brought that up. And that was the point that I was trying to bring up. And anyone who's been on Facebook knows I've also done some additional research on this stuff after. But okay, so back to the presentation. So okay, so I need to kind of explain how to deal with property records. And so I'm going to kind of go segue just a little bit. So first we know at some point a deed is created. So this document will state the date, the grantor, which is the seller, the grantee, the buyer, the consideration, the price, and a description of the property in question. You'll have the signatures of the sellers as well as at least one witness. You'll also have an additional paragraph from a public notary or a justice of the peace certifying that they know the sellers personally or have received appropriate evidence of their identity and can attest that they are the ones who signed the deed. So if a man is selling property with his wife, the certifying officer will also indicate that he questioned the wife separately to ensure that she understood the condition of the sale and agrees to it of her own free will. She's not being coerced by her husband to sign the document. The deed was typically retained by the buyer, so I rarely see an image of the original deed when I'm doing genealogical research. I just realized I totally skipped the paragraph where I introduced why I'm talking about property deeds. So we're talking about this property transaction that occurred on July 12th, 1843, the same date as the polygamy revelation.
Okay.
This is going to relate to documents that I first learned about from Michelle Stone, who published them on her 132 Problems YouTube channel. Um, so I wanted to go over, though, what, as a genealogist, what I expect to find with property records, in order to help you understand what the documents mean that Michelle was bringing up. Genealogists like me, we love property records. Like, I love doing property research. It's really fun. Okay, so what I expect, there was a deed created, but I don't usually see that deed. What I see is the copy of the deed recorded at the county level. So the buyer takes the original signed deed to the county recorder, and after paying a fee, has the recorder handwrite a complete copy into official county record books. And after that's completed, the county recorder writes a note on the original deed giving his name, the date, and where it was recorded. So then the original deed is handed back to the person who brought it in. So getting your deed recorded wasn't required, but it gave you proof of ownership if you lost the original paperwork. Sometimes deeds were recorded at the same day as the property transaction, but more often than not, they were recorded later. I've personally seen deeds that weren't recorded until decades after the original transaction. Usually when the land was sold to someone else and they realized the original deed wasn't recorded, and they're like, oh crap, let's go record both these deeds.
Hmm.
So thanks to the churches, the LDS Church, is obsessed with genealogy, right? So they have these microfilm collections, and many of these county records are digitized and available to access from my home computer. So that's what I'm accessing. I'm accessing these county records. So now let's talk about the deed from the 12th of July, 1843. So I know that the grantor was Joseph Smith, sole trustee and trust for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and the grantees were Emma Smith, Julia M. Smith, Joseph Smith Jr., Frederick G.W. Smith, and Alexander Smith. The consideration given was $10,000 for over 60 lots in the city of Nauvoo. The deed was signed by the grantor, Joseph Smith, and by the witness, William Clayton. The deed was certified by Newell K. Whitney, a justice of the peace, on the 15th of July, 1843. Now, this original document is not extant. I have not seen an image of it. I don't know where it is. So how do I know that it was signed by Joseph Smith, William Clayton, and Newell K. Whitney? Because there's a handwritten copy in Hancock County records. It was recorded at Carthage on the 8th of July, 1844, so a couple weeks after Joseph Smith was killed. So what were the documents that Michelle brought to my attention? What she brought to my attention were draft copies of this deed. One was a draft deed to Hiram Smith, dated on the same day, 12th of July, 1843, for many of the same properties. Also for $10,000. The other draft deed was to Emma Smith and our children, dated the same day. For most of there were a couple mistakes, some crossing out. So here's a close-up of the draft deed to Hiram. The entire deed had been written up in pen by William Clayton. It was just awaiting the signatures of Joseph and a witness, but they never signed it, and that's the circles towards the bottom. That's where the signatures would have gone, with Joseph Smith and then the witness. Instead, as you can see, the decision was made to change the deed to make the grantees Emma Smith and the children. So on the red lines, you can actually see where the name Hiram Smith is written in ink, and you have pencil lines through it with the words Emma Smith, etc., and down Emma Smith, etc. Okay, so we can see, so suddenly we realize, wait, he was initially going to give some of these properties to Hiram, but then a decision was later made to give them to Emma. So here's the front side of the draft deed to Emma and her children. And you can see that there's some crossed out marks at the bottom. When you look at the back of the document, you can tell it's a draft because William Clayton never finished this deed. So it ended up, he was making enough mistakes that he was like, okay, I'll bag it. I'll start over on a new piece of paper. So there's no signatures. He didn't do the little boilerplate language at the end. So why am I showing you the draft deeds? And why are they important? These were the deeds, remember, that Michelle brought to my attention. So why it's important is because of what William Clayton wrote in his diary on the July 12th, 1843. He says, this a.m., this morning, I wrote a revelation consisting of 10 pages on the order of the priesthood, showing the designs in Moses, Abraham, David, and Solomon having many wives and concubines. After it was wrote, Presidents Joseph and Hiram presented it and read it to Emma, who said she did not believe a word of it and appeared very rebellious. Joseph, told me to deed all the unencumbered lots to E. Emma and the children. He appears much troubled about E. Emma.
Hmm.
So some folks have mentioned that they don't like that William Clayton was the scribe for the polygamy revelation because he wasn't a typical scribe for revelations. Um, Andy Ehat actually got up after my presentation and was like, "No, he was a scribe for revelations." So that may not be totally accurate. But what we do know is William Clayton was the real estate guy. He did write the deeds. He was in charge of the real estate transactions. So, what the draft deed to Hiram indicates, though, is that Joseph and Hiram were likely meeting with William Clayton on the morning of the 12th of July, 1843, for a real estate transaction. That was likely the original intent of the meeting. That's why William Clayton had that draft deed drawn up for Hiram. That would have been a perfect opportunity after Hiram and Joseph Smith's discussion on Emma's reticence over polygamy for Joseph to then dictate the revelation to William Clayton, because those three men were meeting in a room. After the confrontation with Emma, a decision was then made to deed many of those lots to Emma and the children rather than Hiram. So the drafts of both Hiram's deed, with his name scratched out, and to Emma Smith, etc., penciled in, and to Emma's deed, confirm that change. So they are actually consistent. Those draft deeds are consistent with the story that William Clayton's writing in his journal. Now, lots of people have previously assumed from Clayton's diary entry that Emma was worried about Joseph Smith deeding land to his plural wives. And that's why, after arguing about the polygamy revelation, the decision was made to deed property to her and the kids. But these draft deeds are telling a different story. So Joseph was planning to deed the land to Hiram, not to other plural wives. And that's also consistent with my research on Joseph Smith's deeds to women in Nauvoo. There are way better explanations for those deeds than polygamy. But so we're not having the right story. These deeds are telling us a different story. And so we need to adjust some of our previous suppositions on how this all was happening.
Hmm.
And so that was the point that I was really wanting to bring out with these deeds that, again, it was Michelle Stone that brought these deeds to my attention. But to me, for her, she sees it as evidence of other issues. But for me, I saw that and I was like, oh my gosh, that's actually helping us understand a little bit better what Clayton was writing in his journal. And so, and that's just where my presentation, I'm gonna end it.
Okay.
Um,
Interesting.
so that, yeah, so that was the point I really wanted to bring up is that Um, and especially after this presentation, when I was doing more research on the Richards manuscript and the Kingsbury manuscript, and then also was looking at the Whitney manuscript and the Deseret News versions of all of these revelations, it just became a lot more obvious by looking at these documents that and I was getting feedback from others. Dan Vogel did a video on it. And I was able to pick up that there's actually two different Deseret News versions. And I was like, oh, I need to actually see what the differences are between those before I can start comparing them to the manuscripts. And then also in the discussion, there was a great idea by Matt Mumford, who mentioned that he's like, hey, have you looked at the Whitney version of the Revelation? And I was like, oh my gosh, so I need to look at that. And so I ended up actually discovering, because of these conversations, because of these collaborations, we end up having a better idea and understanding that there actually is pretty good evidence that Willard Richards was trying to create this printer's copy, because that actually does kind of match the Deseret News version a lot better. But because we've now looked at these documents more, because there were these questions raised, I am now much more comfortable saying that. Like, I'm not just assuming that was the case. I can actually point to specific things that show the transmission and the way that this whole process was done and how the text is showing us how the process was done. Does that make sense?
Makes sense. And I think that it's really important because I think a lot of people have compared this movement to like Holocaust denial movements. And I actually there there are some parallels I can kind of see, but um, one of them would be like so in the 70s, David Irving, who at the time was not a Holocaust denier per se, but in the 1970s was making this challenge, or maybe 80s. Give me one document that proves that Adolf Hitler knew about the Holocaust.
Mhm.
And so that was the argument that he was making, that since we don't have a single document that shows that Hitler authorized um, the Holocaust, that he may have not had anything to do with it and didn't even know about it. It's kind of a similar argument that is being made about Joseph Smith, not knowing about polygamy as well. The
Right. Sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead.
and then in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, Holocaust denial really, really kind of took off. And then it was, and actually, but on the same at the same time, they were putting out information that maybe people didn't real understand either, or they were showing like there were myths about the Holocaust that did exist, like they were making out of humans out of soap or those kind of
Hmm.
things, or soap, from Holocaust victims, they're creating them in soap and stuff like that. So they're pointing out things that were like not quite accurate in the historic record, and there was some mythology that had developed from this thing. This is a very touchy subject, obviously, because we're talking about the
Yeah.
Holocaust. But what we saw was, and what also happened was the scholarly community was like, we do not engage them, period. That was the argument they would make. And so what happened was you kind of had a populist movement, and it was growing within the middle class, and it was seeing growth in Canada, in the United States, where people were starting to accept it. You saw these people going on the Phil Donahue show, and really being very impactful. I remember when all this was happening. But then Skeptic Magazine, I think in the summer of 1994, came out with an issue where they pretty much obliterated much of the arguments that were being made. And the Holocaust deniers never even responded to the Skeptic Magazine takedown. And I was kind of like, why aren't they responding to this? And then in the late 90s, David Irving sued Deborah Lipstadt over accusing her of slander or libel. And it turns out that basically what happened was the Holocaust was kind of put on trial, whether it happened or not, inadvertently. And it was pretty conclusive that ended pretty much the entire Holocaust denial movement with any kind of like legitimacy. And then it just kind of found its
Hmm.
way to the fringes of neo-Nazis and stuff like that. But I think what's so interesting is that there's parallels that I see, but I also see that there's more engagement with the monogamy affirmers or whatever you want to
Yeah.
call them movement, where they are doing a lot of good research. And some people compared, the Journal of Mormon Polygamy to basically being just like the Institute of Historical Reviews or the Barnes Review. Those are Holocaust
Yeah.
denial journals. And I don't think that's what's going on. I actually see that they're allowing like voices like yours and others to be put into the conversation. So, and I also think that they're doing really invaluable work, doing a lot of research with the documents, bringing stuff out that we wouldn't be having this conversation if it wasn't for the
Yeah.
work and the efforts that this group has been doing. And so I look at it as being a real important development where we're actually, because we have access to all these documents finally, and people are able to do their own research. Sure, people are going to look. There might be some conspiracy nut jobs out there that are doing some really weird stuff with all this. I agree, but then there's some really good research that's going on at the same time, and I think that's really good that you acknowledge that, and that it's actually helped inform you and your scholarship as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, and and that's the thing is that because the Richards and the Kingsbury manuscripts and the Whitney manuscripts are all available to look at the original records. We can all individually
Hmm.
look at them and notice different things. Like even after I did my analysis and shared it on Facebook, Dan Vogel was pointing out different things. And he's like, see, this is why I think they were also looking at this one when deciding what to put in the Deseret News. And and it's that conversation that's really valuable because you get all these people who are noticing different elements, and then we can all bring it in together and we can have a better understanding overall. Um, and that's how historical research is supposed to be done. That's why we publish. That's why we make sure we're looking at other people's stuff first because they may have noticed something that maybe I missed, and I need to acknowledge what they've contributed to the conversation. And so this is why it can be a little difficult because sometimes some of these narrative challengers or narrative skeptics they just want to look at the document in a vacuum, and that's what makes it so difficult because as a genealogist, anyone who does historical research, you cannot look at documents in a vacuum. They are always created with within a certain context. And so while it is very understandable that you look at these denials that happened in Nauvoo, these very public denials, if you're not considering the context within which those denials were happening, um, you might be missing some of what was actually going on. And that's something that I've had to deal with as I've been studying criminal conspiracies in Nauvoo. One of my ancestors, that Theodore Turley, he was arrested for counterfeiting in Nauvoo. And so during the Nauvoo period, I should say. And so as I've been investigating all of these criminal conspiracies, I've also been dealing with where I know people are lying, I know people are stretching the truth, but these statements are also giving me a lot of good details. But I have to be able to figure out where's the stretching the truth? What are the details that actually are really helpful, even if I can't take everything at 100% face value? And that's helped me in understanding a lot of the polygamy stuff where it's like, okay, are they phrasing this in a really weird way? Are they doing this to protect themselves? Because with the criminal conspiracies, obviously they're going to always make themselves look a little bit better. If they do admit to wrongdoing, they're going to tend to say that I was forced into it, like against my will, which if you look at other documents, you're like, okay, that wasn't probably true, but they're always going to try to make themselves look a little bit better. And so it brings a little bit of a different perspective. So when people are like, well, they were lying in this, and I'm like, well, people tend to try to make themselves look better than they are. And that was one point that Gary Bergera brought up with the polygamy stuff, where you're dealing with these very transgressive, very like almost embarrassing things to talk about. You have a very high motive to justify yourself. And one way to justify yourself is to talk about how you always knew that it was from God. Like instead of like so with Brigham Young when he's saying that, oh, I got a revelation back in England. I knew before Joseph ever told me that this was from God. Like because this was a later reminiscence, you're like, okay, by that point, he's already been defending polygamy for 20 years. Could he be misremembering and pushing it back in his mind too in order to help justify himself? Yeah, probably. But I'm going to be looking at these statements in total. I'm going to be looking at all of them to try to figure out where is the truth. And it's usually like somewhere in the middle, kind of honestly.
Mhm.
But as a genealogist, I'm dealing with discrepancies all the time. And part of that experience of looking at historical documents and looking at um, and noticing discrepancies is you have to understand when the discrepancies matter and when they don't matter.
Mhm.
And that's something that comes with experience, and it's hard to teach someone. Um, and that's a lot of the missteps that I'm seeing with these narrative challengers, with these skeptics, is they're not understanding which discrepancies are actually really significant and which discrepancies are like, yeah, that's not a big deal. But again, that's an experience issue. So
Yeah, and I think that's true is as well is that we're seeing this movement too, is that they are starting to adopt and use the tools of studying history
yeah,
that maybe they didn't have those tools or understanding just a couple of years ago. So I think this is good that this conversation's happening because I always tell people, I said, I'm in favor of good scholarship across the board. Good scholarship benefits everybody.
yeah,
So when I went to, like, for instance, the Mormon Research Ministry, and just said, listen, I want to help you guys. Not that I agree with everything you're doing, but I really think you guys could do better research than what you're doing. Well, they slammed the door on me, and they didn't want to have,
really?
yeah, they didn't want my help, and they've publicly attacked me, and I'm just like, I was so shocked by that because I was like, no, I want to help you guys do better research because I think better research causes there to be better conversation. So this group that's
Yeah.
trying to convert these Mormons, they're just using 1980s apologetics, and they haven't gone into the 21st century, and they do some important research, but the research they've done on me has been terrible. They've done hit pieces on me. It's been awful. They're basically using AI on me and then putting out these papers. I'm like, guys,
Yeah.
you get an F if you try to produce a paper
Yeah, I
like
would
that.
definitely, yeah.
Yeah, and so um you have all these researchers doing their own thing, and I'm always like, let's step up your game. I don't care if I agree or disagree with you. let's step up your game. Fair Mormon, let's step up your game. Let's put out better research, guys. Okay. Let's do it, Mormonism Research Ministry. Do better research. To the scholars who have poo-pooed the this movement, they're don't ignore some of the stuff they're uncovering, and actually will help your research. And
Yeah.
to to the narrative challengers, whatever you want to call them, continue to learn from the scholars, use those tools, and do better research and do better scholarship. And guess what? We don't have to agree with the conclusions, but let's at least
Mm-mm.
work on doing better research, and we can have better conversations that way. That's what I've been striving to do in so many of these communities. Some are more open to it than others, but I think it's important that I don't care where you're at. Do better research. Let's do better due diligence. Let's also be civil. Let's not do name calling. Let's not do a character assassination. Okay. Let's just stick with the facts and go from there. That's just my plea to this whole conversation here. Let's bring civility into this conversation. Let's bring better scholarship into it, and then come let us reason together.
Yeah. So that was actually my presentation at the Journal of Mormon Polygamy conference. That's what Cheryl had asked me to present on was research techniques, was to actually help people teach them how to do research,
Yeah.
which for me is I teach people how to do family history research all the time. And so for me, that was actually really fun. I got to show them, okay, so here's some tips and tricks that I use specifically for Mormon history research. And so yes, we want to elevate people. But that's the thing. I do recommend a lot more collaboration. It does seem like people are itching for a fight, and I think part of it is that they are so used to people attacking them that they've just kind of gone into this fight stance. And it can be kind of frustrating to try to engage with that because it always seems like they're trying to fight you when you're trying to collaborate with them. So it's something that's, again, it's an issue with both sides, but I do think I agree with Maxine Hanks, and I'm, on the side of Cheryl Bruno, where this can actually really help the scholarly community. It can help the scholarship in Mormonism. Um, so yeah, treat it a little bit more nicely. So,
I totally agree with that, and I'm really grateful to you, Mary, and our friendship, and I'm so glad you're able to come on the show today. And I just excuse me. I want to just share that, this is a minefield, of course. And even when I first entered into this space a few years ago, I knew that I was entering into a minefield because it's such a sensitive thing. Because you have the scholarly world, and you got to understand too, this is what's interesting. When I first started the channel, the intention of my channel was to be a scholarly secular channel. But then one day I get a phone call from an apostle in Independence, Missouri, telling me about the Songs of Zion hymn book, which was this, some would argue, a supernaturally created hymnal by this woman who couldn't carry a tune, and she creates this beautiful music, and it's really an
mhm,
amazing story. And that's when I had that moment. I was like, oh, I also have to be ready for the spiritual to enter into the conversation too.
absolutely.
And I don't think we can ignore that. And I think we need to be very sensitive about this because this is part of people's spiritual journeys that they're on. And in many cases, people in that movement do have like profound spiritual experiences that convince them that Joseph didn't practice polygamy. And in one sense, Joseph gives us that epistemological tool to finding truth.
Yes.
Is that burning in the bosom? All these kind of things. These were introduced into the restoration, and so that's in the bloodstream as well. Maybe talk about that.
It absolutely is just that idea, that that truth is revealed through many ways. That
Mhm.
science is one way that truth is revealed, but personal revelation is another way. And through the prophets. I would say I'm a little bit more used to this kind of mix of revelation and historical research in my work with family history. Family history in the church. So I've worked at our local family search center for 10 years. It is absolutely a work where you get that combination of that religious feeling. I mean, it's just, I don't care what your religion, I've helped people from various religious backgrounds. When you help them find their family, it is incredibly fulfilling. There is definitely a spiritual connection there when people are learning about their ancestors. It's fantastic. like it really is like super cool. But I am also dealing with people who are like, okay, so and so came to me in a dream and said that I need to do, temple work for them, or so and so came to me in a dream and said that I, this person is the right father for this person, or, I feel by the spirit that these two people should be connected. And so for me, I have to sit back as a genealogist and be like, okay, I admit that you had this spiritual action, but when it comes to actual documentation, I need that documentation. I can't just rely solely on your spiritual witness in order to document this accurately so that people can trust it in the system. And so there is that, and I do see that a lot with this polygamy question, because for a lot of people, this is answering these historical questions, coming up with these historical theories is a way that they can retain a testimony, is a way that they feel like they can bring others back into the church or feel like they can save testimonies. But for me as a genealogist and on the historical side, I'm like, well, that's great. And I'm glad you feel that strongly. I'm glad you feel that testimony, but that's a theological thing. And what you're arguing is a historical thing. So, like, we kind of need to separate those two spheres if you're going to be making um, a scholarly argument. If you're going to be writing an article for a journal, we need to kind of stick to the scholarly argument. But absolutely, there are historians, there are many historians, family history people who absolutely feel spiritually propelled, feel spiritually called in order to, use their talents in this way. And that is absolutely valid. It's just that if we're going to have a scholarly conversation, recognize that we can't use those testimonies as evidence when we're talking to other scholars. And that's the cool thing about MHA and about JWHA is we're getting all of these people from various backgrounds, and they are very good at accepting amateur historians, like fantastic. If you bring to the table good research, they will respect you. They will respect the good research. And so, but you can come from many different religious backgrounds. You can have many different views of what this evidence is saying as far as for you spiritually. But when we're coming together as this historical conversation, there is a little bit of a different playing field. And so that's where sometimes we can get a little mixed up in this conversation is that some people are playing by scholarly rules and other people are kind of playing by religious theological rules. And sometimes we're talking past each other with those.
Certainly. And I think it's really important to make it very clear that it's not just the narrative challengers of polygamy that are claiming to have these experiences. I deal with the whole Joseph Smith photo conversation and controversy. And there are people who say, no, that's not Joseph Smith because I saw him in a vision. He didn't look like that. And others say that
Right.
I saw Joseph Smith in a vision. He looks exactly like that photo. And so I have that happening in that community. I also have
Right.
people in the polygamy community or who basically say, I actually have a very powerful testimony about the validity of Joseph Smith's polygamy and that's why I'm practicing the principle. And that's why I'm actually leaving or have been excommunicated from my church because I believe in it so strongly that I'm joining up
Yeah.
with the fundamentalists. And then you have other people who are saying, I don't believe this, and we're going with Denver Snuffer. So there's so much of that that's going on. I don't want to make it very clear that this is all across the board in the restoration. And so I have this young man who reached out to me the other day and said, well, why don't you pray to God to see if Joseph Smith was a prophet or not? And I'm like, that's not how I process information, and that's not how I look for the truth because I see I see how the downside of that is that you have contradictory testimonies on the very same topic. So for me as an outsider, just trying to look at it logically, it's like even if I were to have a testimony that Joseph Smith is a prophet, I would have to still question that feeling at the same time to be intellectually honest, at the same time. So that's
Yeah.
that's why it wouldn't be a useful thing for me because, I can see myself like maybe just doing a Book of Mormon readathon. I read it really intensely and maybe I fast and maybe I'm reading all this stuff and next thing you know I have this visitation. Well, that could have been just happened as those are naturalistic explanations as to why those things
Yeah.
could occur too. So that's why I'm very careful, but I'm not also at the same time poo-pooing people's spiritual experiences as well. This
No,
is the
and that's what I wanted to point out. Like even
yeah.
in family history, with very personal things, with not huge religious movements, even very personal things, people are relying a lot on, these spiritual promptings and these spiritual experiences. And that to me, the religion is so intensely personal. Like I'm not gonna reflect on that. But if I'm going to be entering it into family search, if I'm going to be, I want to have some sort of documentary record. That's for me as a genealogist, that's my responsibility is to make sure I have something to back this up. And so, and that's what I'm trying to explain to others is that when we're dealing with the history and we're dealing with these historical questions, we are dealing with this other playing field of rules about scholarly discourse. But what I'm saying with like MHA and WHA, people of various religious beliefs can absolutely come together and engage with these same rules of scholarly discourse and have very productive conversations, even if they religiously feel very strongly about different beliefs.
Well, I love it. This was a great conversation. That reminds me, Dr. Kyle Bashirs is an evangelical Christian who sits on the board of directors of John Whitmer Historical Association.
Mhm.
Somebody actually nominated me for what that position too. And I actually called Casey Griffiths and said, "Listen, I'm too busy. I can't do it." But my point being is that they're open to having different people come
Yes.
on from different faith things. And what's so cool about Kyle is the works that he's working on is going to completely change the conversation between evangelicals and the Restoration. All the 1980s, apologetics garbage, the Walter Martin stuff that's just so out of date now, is we're going to have a 21st century conversation with the
Hmm.
Restoration. It's due. So it's another example of an evangelical doing really good research, and we're kind of just moving past a lot of the previous. And look, we got to honor the people in the past that done the good work, but we also have to move on with new tools and new information, and also have an understanding that we are all image bearers and we are created in his image, and we need to recognize that, and we need to recognize the humanity and our spiritual, how we are spiritually all related to each other as being fellow image bearers, and proceed in the conversations that way. Mary Ann Clements, thanks for being an awesome image
Yeah.
bearer, an awesome human, an awesome scholar, an awesome mom, and
I don't know, you'd have to ask my kids on that one.
and an awesome friend. Thank you so much for coming on.
Yep. No problem.
All right. Did you want to say any final words you want to share with the audience, or do you think we covered everything?
Just that, it's fun to geek out on Mormon history with
Absolutely.
people who love geeking out. And so just thank you for my kids don't like hearing this stuff.
Right.
So it's
Exactly.
nice to have someone, it's nice to find your people that you can geek out on Mormon
Oh,
history with.
absolutely. Yep. It really is. It's like when I go to these conferences, I'm a kid in the candy store. I love it. But I also realize, like, before I started this channel, all I knew were just the books, reading the
Yeah.
articles, reading the books. And then I get to meet the authors of these papers and books and realize there's a dimensionality going on to meeting these people, and
Yeah.
also meeting the people that are talked about in these scholarly things, and realizing, wow, there's so much more to it than just the dry facts, just the
Yeah.
words written on the page. Like you said, we need to expand it to all these different other ways of looking at it and other lenses as well. And that's why I appreciate what you're doing. All right, folks. Well,
Okay.
what do you think? What do you think of this conversation? What do you think of Mary's presentation? I found it to be very fascinating. I also think it's really important that her work was informed by the work that Michelle and Jeremy are doing. And so we have to also acknowledge that and honor them in that way as well. And tell me what you think in the comments, folks. Let's keep it civil. Let's remember you're talking to a fellow image bearer, even when you can't stand them. That's the world that we live in, and it will be for a while until Zion is established. Either way, there'll be links in the description for those of you who'd like to financially support the channel. Also, we'll have links to Maryann. Do you have anything you want to link up in the show notes? Will you send them to me?
Um, Maybe I'll send you something later, but right
Okay.
now, no.
Yeah, just
But yeah.
okay. If you find anything you want to have put in the
Yeah.
show notes, I'll put them in there so people can access those as well. So, but remember, the most important thing is this: all the voices of the Restoration will be heard here on Mormon Book Reviews.